Mr. Chair, I have several questions about some of the most common complaints that I've heard about Basel III Endgame. I have an open mind on the subject, but I want to hear your response to some of the arguments that have been leveled against it. First, the Fed has repeatedly reassured the public that the banking system is well capitalized. Yet the Fed is advancing Basel III on the assumption that the banking system is undercapitalized. So the first question is, how do you reconcile the Fed's repeat assurances about a well-capitalized banking system with Basel III's assumption of an undercapitalized banking system? The second question, if the purpose of Basel III is to align US banks with their banking peers elsewhere in the world, why is the Fed imposing requirements that are more stringent than those prescribed by Basel III? In other words, why is the Fed, quote unquote, gold plating? The third question is, how do you reconcile Basel III's recommendation for standardization with Congress's statutory requirement for tailoring? Standardization would seem to be in conflict or in tension with regulatory tailoring. And the fourth and final question, do you think that Basel III could have the unintended consequence of reinforcing the trend toward shadow banking, which would mean less regulation, not more? Is there a sense in which we are transferring risk from the regulated sector of the financial system to the deregulated sector? So I bombarded you with 4 questions, and I'll give you the time you need to answer them.
I'm going to have a hard time reading my handwriting here, but I'll start with yes to the fourth one. I'll give you that one because that is clearly a risk. We've seen intermediation activity moving out of the regulated system, and this has the risk of doing more of that. So what was, in a word or two, what was one again?
Just you said, and you testified,
capital, yeah.
Repeat reassurances about the capitalization of the banking
So
system.
I addressed this in my remarks in the open board meeting. You know, higher capital is always going to add to safety and soundness, but there's a cost.
Right.
And so identifying the precise right level is very, very difficult. It's hard to do it objectively. I've said for years in these rooms that I thought that the level of capital in the U.S. banking system was about right. So I opposed, and I voted for all these increases during Dodd-Frank. So I think it's a very fair question. We'll be looking at that. The second one was?
The concern about gold plating.
About?
Gold plating?
Oh, gold plating, yeah. No, it is, and I said this in my public remarks, that we're exceeding the minimums with this proposal, and we also exceeded what the other big jurisdictions are doing. And so that's a question. That's a good question. I'll agree.
Okay, great.
And the third?
And the third is, I think you more or less, and standardization versus tailoring.
Standardization of, it was something specific.
Yeah, so Congress passed a statute requiring regulatory tailoring.
No, that's an excellent
and do you think
question.
Basel III is in compliance with that
I addressed
statute?
in my comments too. I think you're right. We do need to take on board the lessons of Silicon Valley Bank as it relates to the smaller, large banks, but we don't need to throw away the tailoring that's required by the law, but also that is appropriate if we're going to have a diverse banking system.
You know, the collapse of SVB was largely a story about liquidity risk and interest rate risk, yet the focal points of Basel III are credit risk, market rate risk, and operational risk. Like, what is your response to the criticism that the Fed should focus its energies on addressing the forms of risk that were responsible for the SVB bank failure rather than focusing on forms of risk that were largely unrelated to it?
So I agree with that, but I would say we are working on a package of liquidity measures which directly addresses the Silicon Valley Bank situation. We've also taken a lot of supervisory actions with other medium and small sized banks that had a lot of uninsured deposits and a lot of real estate risk and things like that. So we've been doing quite a lot on the supervisory section that it doesn't require new rules.
And then finally, as you know, the crippling cost of housing accounts for 1/3 of inflation. One of the most powerful tools for producing and preserving affordable housing is the low-income housing tax credit, which has financed nearly 4 million units of affordable housing. The banking system accounts for 85% of LIHTC investments, and there's a concern that Basel III, in its present form, would diminish the availability of LIHTC and the amount of affordable housing development. And so I'm just curious, is that on your radar, and is that something you're willing to examine?
Yes, it is.
So with that, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.